can I write a Thing movie that doesn't suck? Fade in on a large bird splayed helplessly in the dirt. Small tentacles reaching into every orifice from somewhere off screen. They pulse for a moment, then slowly retract. The bird blinks, stands, looks around, and flies away. It's flying over the ocean now. It lands on the water and tries to assimilate a dolphin, but something's wrong, and the dolphin easily escapes. Now it's haggard. Its feathers are puffy, shedding with every flap. It scans the water below and sees a military ship in the distance. The music swells. Pacific Ocean, 1944. On the deck of a Japanese ship, a sailor spots a small island in the distance. We see Japanese sailors gearing up in hazmat suits and flamethrowers. Suddenly, the bird slams into the steel wall of the ship. A sailor investigates to see it half-mutated, grotesque, somewhere between monster and roadkill, twitching on the floor. But before he can get a good enough look at it, chaos erupts as the other Japanese crewmen start yelling and pointing toward the ocean. And farther away, with the island and Japanese ship in the distance, we see the top of an American submarine slip beneath the water. That's the opening of the Thing movie I'm trying to write. But you probably noticed that this isn't a sequel to Carpenter's movie. That's because continuing Carpenter's movie would only invite comparison to a movie it couldn't possibly compete with. An ambiguous ending is still an ending, and we like debating all the unanswered questions, so don't answer them.
Where were you, Charles?
A Thing franchise could totally work as an anthology though, because you don't need MacReady, Outpost 31, or even Snow to make a good Thing movie. All you really need is the Thing itself. So here's the challenge. I'm going to test my argument by building a treatment right here, not as a real pitch, but as a writing exercise to see how strong the Thing paranoia story engine is once you strip away everything else. I also want to see if I have what it takes to break a story and build something that keeps you on the edge of your seat. So we'll go act by act, what the act needs, the story I came up with, and then my notes on what worked, what worries me, and what has to carry into the next section. In order to build an anthology Thing franchise, we first need to boil the Thing creature down to a game engine that can create a wide variety of stories. And that core engine is an enclosed ecosystem with an alien that assimilates people, creating a whodunit where the who can change at any moment. If the Thing escapes to civilization, the humans lose. Before I start, I need to figure out what Act 1 is actually trying to do. Carpenter's movie is half mystery, half paranoia and deduction. Act 1 is the dog in the Norwegian camp. Act 2A is where we learn that people can be imitated, civilization is at risk, and someone inside may already be infected. And Act 2B is where the paranoia really begins. But a new Thing movie can't spend half its runtime uncovering the rules that most of the audience would already know. I propose that we compress the function of Carpenter's Act 1 and 2A into our Act 1, which gives us both halves of Act 2 to use those rules to play with. And I also want to mention 2 points of personal philosophy I have for this movie. First, I don't want anyone making stupid mistakes. The Thing is highly intelligent, and I want the main characters to be smart as shit, like seeing Light and Elle face off. And second, even though there are twists and turns, I want it to be better on rewatches, like Carpenter's movie is. The snow and ice of Antarctica are a major part of the Thing aesthetically and thematically, but story-wise, it functions basically as a remote location and a way for the Thing to hibernate. So the next thing I need to do is set up an isolated location and situation. I've been watching a lot of Submarine movies as I've worked on the series over the past year, and I think it could work. And to the fans of the Thing lore, I'm aware that the Thing comic had a sequence on a submarine, but this would be way different. Now, I know what you're thinking. There are 2 major problems with setting the story on a submarine. 1, such a confined space would make it difficult for the Thing to be alone with someone long enough to assimilate them. And 2, there would be too many characters. Decent-sized submarines had at least 60 men, so I need to figure out how to get most of the people out of the submarine and out of the story, and I think I've come up with a really cool solution to this problem, based on a couple of actual historical events. My initial thought was that a submarine would find a strange survivor of a shipwreck or something floating in the ocean, but I think I can come up with something better if I utilize a situation in which we pare down the crew of the sub to our main characters. This is where I quickly realized that I would need a secondary location to make the story work. Looking into it, there are 2 real incidents that I'll base the situation off of. The first is the USS Darter, which damaged Japanese cruisers and then got stuck on a shoal and had to be evacuated. And the second is the USS Flyer, which hit a mine and sank, but a small group of survivors managed to make it to an island. So for the story, the American sub sinks a Japanese ship off the coast of a small island, and the American sub is damaged before the Japanese ship sinks. They evacuate most of the submarine to an island, while a skeleton crew stays behind for repairs. This way, I can have the island serve as a kind of spooky unknown threshold that we can cross into in Act 2, and it would allow me to bring in the survivors of the Japanese ship that could cause a small microcosm of the war to break out on the island while the Thing makes its moves. And I can have the Thing use race to heighten the paranoia, which would contribute to the overall themes. So I'm mainly going to use clips from Das Boot because that's the aesthetic I'm going for, and U-571 because they have a skeleton crew, and I'm aware that these both take place on German submarines. I also toured the USS Pampanito and took tons of pictures and videos. I got a list of the main jobs on a submarine, and assigned actors to them to help me keep track of who is who. This isn't a fantasy cast or anything, it's just a way to keep track of everyone. And I'll refer to the characters by the actors' last names so it'll be easier to follow who I'm talking about. And as you can see, there's apparently not a whole lot of room for diversity on American World War II submarines. Finally, if we're going to have the main characters understand the Thing threat enough by the end of Act 1 to play the game in Act 2, then I need to make a list of rules to establish. Here are the confirmed rules of Carpenter's original that I need to communicate by the end of Act 1. It can imitate people, it needs contact and time to assimilate, assimilation tears apart the victim's clothes, fire kills it, bullets don't, it transforms when threatened, and it's smart enough to strategize. There are other implied rules that I'll deal with as they become relevant. It can't infect dead bodies, infected people know they're infected, it has knowledge from previous hosts, it prefers stealth because it's vulnerable when exposed, it could assimilate humanity if it reaches civilization, and it's theorized that a single cell could potentially infect a person. So next I'll show you what I came up with for Act 1, but first I need to add a new rule to make this movie work. It's not something that conflicts with Carpenter's movie, but something that gives the ocean a story function and prevents the Thing from simply swimming away. And the rule that I landed on is salt water doesn't kill the Thing, but it does interfere with the Thing's ability to assimilate. I'll bring this concept out in 3 beats, and the first was in the opening when the bird thing can't assimilate the dolphin. Okay, on to Act 1. Where did I leave off? Oh right, the Japanese sailors start yelling and pointing to the ocean as we cut to a wide shot of the top of an American submarine submerging underwater. Inside the sub, we see the American crew functioning like a machine. Captain Powell commands, second in command Butler cautions, Holt calculates, Chalamet listens, Chief of the boat Cavill keeps the crew steady, and Wolfhart is eager for violence. Cavill passes around a pinup lighter called Betty for the men to touch for luck. Hemsworth wears his lucky Notre Dame sweater under his chambray shirt. The Americans sink the Japanese ship, but Powell pushes for extra shots after Butler warns they've stayed exposed too long. While reloading the torpedoes, Wolfhart shoves a young sailor out of the way, tearing the side of the kid's shirt on a gear. The Japanese respond with depth charges, damaging the submarine. Now the Americans are stranded. The Japanese ship was escorting a cargo ship that got away, meaning reinforcements may be coming. So Powell has Holland, the radio man, call for a rescue. At first, a rescue ship seems like the solution. An American ship is on the way with parts, but it will take a day or two. During some downtime, Cavill loses the Betty lighter to Mescal in a poker game. The Betty lighter has basically become a mascot of the boat and has been passed around between the men through various poker games. After winning, Mescal gives Cavill a Madame Butterfly burlesque matchbook that an annoyed Cavill stuffs in his breast pocket. Wolfhard makes something called torpedo juice for the crew by siphoning torpedo fuel and mixing it with fruit juice in vinegar bottles. In another compartment, Holt patches the young sailor's lucky torn chambray shirt with a red bandana. Cavill briefs Holland, Poulter, and Garfield, who will scout the other end of the island for Japanese survivors. He gives Garfield a red field notebook to note ranks, weapons, and other important info. Most of the crew evacuates to the nearby island to dig in, while a skeleton crew stays on board. Mescal gives Holland the Betty lighter for luck before he goes. That night, tons of explosions go off on the island. Powell and Butler can only watch in shock from the sub. The next morning, Holland, Hoffman, and Poulter return with a dazed Japanese officer, Mifune. They say he has refused to speak so far. They seem shaken, but Poulter is eagerly showing the others Mifune's katana that is now his. Most of the submarine crew on the island are dead. The Japanese survivors attack them with flamethrowers and satchel charges, which immediately feels wrong. Why would they have all that gear? During the interrogation, Mifune tries to communicate, but his English is limited. Holland claims he speaks some Japanese and translates for him. Then Chalamet discovers the radio is dead. 2 radio crystals have been ripped out. This makes no sense to the crew because they already radioed for the rescue. Mifune realizes something before the Americans do. He points at Holland and starts shouting. The situation erupts. Poulter threatens Mifune with the katana, and Mifune grabs his katana from Poulter and stabs Holland in the throat. Holland bleeds out in Mescal's arms, but then Mescal finds the broken radio crystals in Holland's pocket. Now Powell and Butler have an impossible problem. Why would Holland sabotage the radio, and why would Mifune kill the saboteur? Holland's body is taken to the forward torpedo room. Mescal asks for a moment alone with him. He finds the Betty lighter in Holland's pocket, and then he notices Holland's wound looks wrong, almost like it's healing. He lights the Betty lighter to get a better look, and the blood moves away from the flame. Then Holland speaks. Holland was never dead, he was just playing dead. He grabs Mescal and begins assimilating him. Chalamet walks in, sees what's happening, panics, shuts the hatch, and runs for help. When the others open the hatch, Mescal is standing there naked, with his torn clothes on the floor. For a second, he sounds exactly like Mescal, but then the thing mutates. Bullets barely do anything. Mescal thing and Holland thing combine into a large monster. Powell is slashed across the forearm by a wild whipping tentacle with teeth. Back in the other compartment, Mifune manages to say one word clearly: fire. Holt grabs bottles of torpedo juice. Radcliffe brings the blowtorch, and it's a struggle, but they burn it. The men stand under the conning tower's hatch to the outside to breathe as the smoke dissipates, but now they know something insane is going on. So that was Act 1, and here's what I think. The craft problem for Act 1 was basically, how do I do what Carpenter's Act 1 does, turn mystery into rules through action, without pretending the audience doesn't already know what the thing is? I set up Mifune's character to begin as a way of filling in some of the knowledge gaps by having someone who already knows what the thing is. He just can't communicate it effectively. My idea was that Holland Thing, since he was assimilated by a Japanese thing on the island, would understand Japanese through inherited memories, and could use that to control the information coming from Mifune. I think some of the crewmates would think it's strange that they didn't know he spoke Japanese, but since no one knew what they were dealing with besides Mifune, Holland Thing needed to stop him from communicating the threat. I also liked Holland Thing playing dead because it's obvious he wouldn't survive the wound if he was human. Then, once Mescal starts figuring out something isn't right, he's forced into a risky assimilation. Otherwise, he could have just played a corpse until the rescue boat arrived. I think exploring those weird questions surrounding the thing concept is what I'll need to do to keep people engaged through the next sections. I need to find a situation that forces the creature's rules to express themselves. I also need to ensure that any mistake a character makes is because they were forced into a desperate situation, because I think the character's strategies are some of the most interesting aspects. I need the thing to be forced into making offensive moves rather than just hanging back. And of course, this is a stripped-down version of what the movie would be, so I hope my setups aren't too obvious here. That's something Carpenter's movie does really well. The torn clothing is planted early and then reinforced right before it becomes important. So in my version, Betty, the red patch, the radio crystals, and Holland speaking Japanese all need to feel normal at first and then evidence later. I think the biggest breakthrough was how the rescue ship begins as a solution to their problem of being stranded, and then becomes a ticking clock that forces them to solve who is infected before time runs out. That feels like the Act 1 turn I needed. In Carpenter's version, the kennel scene reveals the monster and changes the movie, but here, the first transformation does that too, but the rescue ship adds the larger strategic problem. The thing doesn't have to kill everyone, it just has to survive long enough to be picked up. I also found it helped me a lot structurally to have the island attack as a mysterious off-screen event with more urgent stakes, and I've been playing a good amount of One Night Ultimate Werewolf to help with this. I thought it would be more interesting to have the mysterious event be something that took place after the story had already started, and using two locations allowed me to do that without a straight-up ellipse. So instead of the mystery being what happened before the movie started, it becomes what happened while we were trapped somewhere else, and that gives Act 2 something to investigate without feeling like exposition. The thing I'm not sure about is whether it's believable the crew would move so quickly to accepting the alien threat, understanding the rules, and the endgame stakes. I'm also hoping that showing the evacuation and then soon after showing the group return isn't too jarring. I could have Butler and Powell share some character development on the deck when they see the bombs going off on the island, but I'm already not sure that this is going to fit within 30 or so minutes. So the result is, I think Act 1 builds the game rules, it establishes the organism, the ticking clock, and the two location structure, and I need to make sure the rules come through action. In Carpenter's movie, Act 2A is where the threat moves from "there's a thing" to "one of us may be the thing." The autopsy explains imitation, we start getting suspicions, the origins increase the scope, we get the stakes, we see a person can be assimilated, and they become fully isolated. I think we toss out the origins aspect because we've seen it and it's better to keep the ambiguity here. 2A is where Carpenter transitions from learning about the thing to containment. And the submarine characters have a good idea of what's going on about the thing threat, and they know it came from the island where the others are located. 2A is where I can split the investigation into two competing threads, the sub-thread and the island thread, that I hope to converge at the beginning of Act 3. So while the sub-thread is about containment, I need to make the island thread have a different function for 2A. What I need to establish is a fresh engine. Carpenter's movie is structured basically like set piece aftermath, transition, new set piece, and so on. So the obvious way to start 2A is to have them deal with the aftermath of what's happened, basically explain to the audience where we're currently at, have them form a plan, and start the plan but add an unexpected wrinkle. Since we have the mystery of what happened overnight, we can start getting into that and seeing if the various accounts add up. And I can use the island thread to have the characters really try to uncover that mystery. There's also a lot of debate about whether or not you can become infected by contamination. I think I can use this to play with the audience. So then the submarine thread becomes ambiguous rules, and I can use this to work in the themes of paranoia stemming from incomplete information. Another idea I had was, what if we use dramatic irony to actually show the audience that someone is a thing, but the characters don't know for sure? And I really like MacReady's loss of control in Carpenter's Act 2B. I think it will be key for our Act 2A to have at least one control reversal so that the characters must fight both the thing and the humans. So Act 2A needs to test a few things. Can I use the thing reveal to build paranoia? And can I have the characters be right but lose control because they're unable to prove it? Okay, so here is my Act 2A. We see Radcliffe, Holt, and Butler hoist the wrapped pieces of the thing corpse up through the main hatch and dump them overboard into the sea. Hoffman bandages Powell's arm and finds goo in the wound. Hoffman suggests quarantine, but Powell pushes back. Mescal took about 5 minutes to assimilate, and Chalamet saw Holland and Mescal physically fuse together. So Powell starts building the first strategy. They can't trust Hoffman, Poulter, or Mifune yet. They know fire kills it. They know bullets don't work. From what they saw with Mescal, they deduce that it tears through your clothes when it takes you over, and they know the thing needs time and physical contact. Holt creates a weapon, rigging a blowtorch with open bottles of torpedo juice. The problem is that it only works once before you need to refill the bottles. Then Powell and Butler start interrogating the survivors. First is Poulter. He says Holland, Hemsworth, and Garfield were scouting the island when they were ambushed. Garfield was shot in the back and left behind. Later, Holland supposedly took Hoffman and Hemsworth to retrieve Garfield's body, but they came back with Mifune instead. Hoffman's story is similar but not quite the same. He says Holland went off with Hemsworth and Poulter, and also mentions that Wolfhard, who he thought had been killed, somehow turned up the next morning without a scratch. Mifune can't explain much in English, but he points to the island as his destination and draws grotesque creatures inside the island's borders. So the leadership starts piecing it together. The Japanese knew something was on the island, which explains the hazmat suits, the flamethrowers, and the satchel charges. Holland sabotaged the radio after the rescue call went out because he wanted to make sure it couldn't be called off. If that rescue ship arrives before they know who is human, the thing could reach the mainland. Radcliffe comes down from the deck of the sub and tells the others that the island has sent a Morse code message asking for food. Powell, Butler, and Holt realize this could be a trap. There's no mention of the thing, so they decide Butler and Holt will go to the island, pretend everything is fine, and quietly compare the survivors' accounts. Butler can also use his rank in doing this. Hemsworth seems the most suspicious because both Hoffman and Poulter said that he was with Holland that morning. Chalamet is already rattled from seeing Mescal assimilated, and he talks to Hoffman and Poulter as he guards them. Hoffman quietly brings up Powell's wound and the possibility of contamination. Maybe the goo in Powell's arm means he's becoming infected. Butler and Holt leave the sub, acknowledging to Powell that they can't confirm their humanity when they come back. As they approach the island, Butler and Holt see Hemsworth waiting for them on the beach. Hemsworth says that he was with Holland, Hoffman, and Poulter when they found Mifune. So both Hoffman and Poulter were lying if Hemsworth is correct. But when Butler asks Hemsworth where his jacket is, Hemsworth says he covered Garfield's body with it out of respect, and he tugs on his ear when he says this. This was his tell from the poker game the previous night. They reach the remaining survivors, Cavil, Wolfhard, and a Japanese prisoner named Shishido. Cavil says they were attacked again after the others left for the sub, and what bothers him is that the Japanese seem to know exactly where the camp's blind spot was. There were 2 attackers. They wounded and captured Shishido and took his flamethrower and grenades. Wolfhard tells them that a young sailor named Spiegel survived the whole night just to be killed by this asshole, and then he kicks Shishido. He gestures to where they buried him nearby. Cavill thinks the Japanese are hiding some kind of chemical weapon or gas. Wolfhard agrees, saying maybe they've all been exposed to something already. Then he quietly tells Butler that Hahn, Hoffman, and Poulter seemed off after they came back together. Elsewhere on the island, we see Nakadai. The other Japanese survivor is burning bodies with a flamethrower and writing in Garfield's red notebook. We see Nakadai out of focus in the background as the camera pushes in on the face of one corpse about 30 feet away, Plummer, the other torpedo man. Back on the sub, Powell calls Chalamet into his quarters. He says only Powell, Chalamet, and Radcliffe are verified humans. If anything happens to Powell, Chalamet is in charge, and if the island sends up a flare signaling the Japanese are coming, Chalamet needs to find a way to dive the sub. Chalamet notices that Powell has charts and tools laid out and starts to suspect Powell is up to something. He goes back to Hoffman and Poulter and tells them Powell is acting strange. Hoffman and Poulter push the fear further by suggesting that Powell is contaminated, locking down the sub and preparing to kill the humans. Meanwhile, on the island, Butler, Holt, and Hemsworth find the original camp littered with bodies. Their supply crates are destroyed, and the bodies are smoldering from Nakadai's flamethrower. Then they find Plummer, cowering in the jungle with torn clothing. Plummer claims he fell down a hill during the attack, and hid from a Japanese soldier with a flamethrower. Butler doesn't buy it. He privately tells Holt that he's sure Plummer is a thing, but Holt says they need more evidence. They take Plummer back to the camp, and Plummer tells his story to Cavill and Wolfhard, but it just doesn't sit right with Butler. However, Butler makes his move. He tells Holt to guard the others and orders them to step away and drop their weapons. Confused, they obey. Butler points the flamethrower at Plummer in an attempt to show the others how he'll mutate when he is burned. But the flamethrower won't light. Plummer panics. Cavill thinks that Butler has lost it, and pulls out the flare gun and fires a flare at him, knocking him down, and the others tackle Butler before he can do anything. Later, Cavill and Wolfhard leave to signal the sub and report what happened. Holt quietly tells Butler that he'd be tied up too if he didn't help the others stop him. They need another flare now that Cavill fired their only one. Plummer says Garfield had extra flares, and Holt volunteers to go with him to retrieve them, knowing that he couldn't let Plummer be alone with Hemsworth. Holt asks Hemsworth for the flamethrower, but Hemsworth gives Holt a gun instead because the flamethrower won't help him much against the rogue Nakadai. Holt shares one last look with Butler and then goes off alone with Plummer. Back on the sub, Chalamet sees Radcliffe tightening hatches, checking seals, and marking which compartments get shut first. Radcliffe says Powell ordered it. That's enough for Chalamet. He decides Powell is locking down the boat and planning to flood compartments. Hoffman and Poulter agree they need to mutiny. On the island, Holt and Plummer walk through the jungle. Plummer talks like Plummer, using specific memories and friendship to keep Holt doubting himself. We cut to Cavill and Wolfhard, who hear something in the trees. They investigate and find Nakadai writing in Garfield's red notebook. They ambush Nakadai, who drops the red notebook and runs. Cavill yells to Wolfhard to pick it up, and they chase after him. Nakadai leads them to a clearing where Cavill and Wolfhard stumble into the grotesque, mutated, burnt corpse of a Japanese soldier thing. They freak out, but they continue chasing Nakadai. Back to Holt and Plummer. Plummer asks for some water from Holt's canteen, but when Holt gets close, he sees it. Inside Plummer's open jacket is the same red patch he sewed onto the young sailor's torn shirt. Holt runs. Plummer chases him to the beach and into the surf. He tries to assimilate Holt, but the saltwater interferes with the exposed tissue. His tentacles weaken, and he stumbles back from the water, still trying to sound human. Then Nakadai appears from behind and torches Plummer thing. Holt thinks he's saved, until Nakadai turns the flamethrower on him too. Holt rolls into the surf, badly burnt but alive. Cavill and Wolfhard arrive, shoot Nakadai's fuel canister, causing it to spray fuel and burn him alive, and they drag the screaming Holt away as Plummer thing burns on the beach. At the same time, Chalamet makes his move on the sub. He disarms Radcliffe and then goes with Hoffman and Poulter to confront Powell. Powell says they're making a mistake, but Chalamet can't take that chance. Okay, so 2A was way difficult, but I think I managed to play the two paranoia threads off of each other. I think they're different enough to each be interesting in their own way. What worked for me is that the two threads create different kinds of tension. I think it works to bring in the ambiguity of Powell's potential contamination on the sub, while I use the dramatic irony of Plummer thing on the island. On the sub, we don't know if Powell is infected. On the island, the audience is ahead of the characters. I think the longer I can keep the ambiguity going, the more and more tension there will be. My hope is that the push in on Plumber Thing's face reads that he's not just a human playing dead, but shows that he's a thing. This is where I brought in the second of the 3 saltwater beats. My idea is to hint at the rule with the opening bird thing beat, confirm it with this beat, and then use it somewhat subtly in the last beat. I wanted to have both Butler and Powell lose control, but not at the same time to make the threads feel too similar. I like that Plumber Thing complicated Butler's cover story plan because it wouldn't make sense to the others for him to bring up the Thing threat seemingly out of the blue. But I also like that it leaves the less certain Holt to try and solve the Plumber Thing problem on his own. I think I was able to work in the theme that being right is not enough in a story about paranoia. Butler is right about Plumber, but because he can't prove it in a way that the group accepts, he still loses control. I think that Holt and Plumber Thing going off together can turn into a really tense scene, because the subtext is so clear but neither is willing to acknowledge it. And that might be the most useful thing Act 2A gave me going forward. Scenes where everyone knows what the scene is really about, but no one can say it directly. I know this is a compressed version of the story, but what I'm unsure about is if the red patch is too obvious a setup, and I don't know, the wrestling in the surf seemed a little off. Also, I had a couple beats referencing the flamethrower canister could explode if shot, and then looked it up and learned that it wouldn't explode. I think it might be cool to leave those references in and then subvert the expectation with it spraying fuel and igniting rather than exploding. And lastly, I'm a bit concerned that the island thread is too complex and the submarine thread is too simple. The island is more chaotic, requiring Butler to piece together the mystery of something that happened earlier to determine who might be infected, whereas the sub is more about the immediate situation. I just need to make sure that the island thread is still easy enough to follow without too much of having to keep track of who said what. So the result is, Act 2A mostly works for me because it turns the story from revealing the thing into a logic game. The risk is being too complex, and Act 2B needs to escalate that by making each piece of proof create more problems as it solves others. In Carpenter's movie, Act 2B is basically where the movie gets deep into the paranoia. The blood sabotage proves someone is working against them. MacReady takes control, loses control when Knowles finds his torn clothes, and then claws control back and finally forces everyone into the blood test. I need to do something similar without just repeating it. So for my Act 2B, the writing problem is, how do I escalate now that everyone knows the rules? And how can I make the clues and unraveling the mystery create more paranoia rather than prevent it? For Act 2B, the core of my new story engine is basically already set up. On the island, everyone now understands the Thing threat, and on the sub, the unverified Hoffman and Poulter are in charge. I think it works to have the only verified human in a position of power on the sub be someone who is panicky and seems easily manipulated. I also like that at this point, we don't know whether Powell is the protagonist on the sub or Hoffman. My goal is to push that ambiguity as long as possible. Also, I had the flamethrower not light when Butler tried to torch Plumber Thing. I need to bring that back in again to prove it wasn't a coincidental plot convenience. And I have Garfield's red notebook in play. This needs to cause some sort of big visual plot moment. The clothing clues also need to start becoming evidence. The Notre Dame sweater, Garfield's body, and the matchbook all need to start paying off as part of the clothing rule. Whoever the Thing is, they need to be proactive and make a move now that the island group are on the same page about what's going on. Also, the Thing should weaponize the host's personality before it ever has to transform. Norris being so likable was a great misdirect. Also, Act 2B is where I need to do my big test set piece, but they still need to discover the method. But the test can't work in the same way that Carpenter's does. If the blood test simply gives us the answer, then the game is over. So my test needs to feel like progress while actually making the situation worse. I also need to find a satisfying way to pare down the characters as we move into Act 3, so I can make it more focused. So the job of Act 2B is escalation. Discover clues, the clues build suspicion, bring back the ritual of the test scene, but make sure that Act 3 doesn't start with answers. Okay, here's Act 2B. Cavill and Wolfhard drag Holt back to camp, badly burned but alive. They untie Butler. Holt tells Butler that Plumber was one of those things, and that it couldn't take him over in the saltwater. Holt knows he's not going to make it, so he asks Butler to mercy kill him. Butler is furious, but Cavill tells him that Nakadai dropped Garfield's red notebook, and that there's something he and Hemsworth need to see. Cavill and Wolfhard bring the others to the burnt, mutated Japanese corpse, and Butler explains what happened on the sub. Mifune stabbed Holland, but Holland was already infected. He played dead, then tried to turn Mescal into one of them. It imitated them perfectly. The only difference was that it tore through Mescal's clothes and left him naked, saying that their own mothers couldn't tell if they were one of those things. Then Butler realizes the Japanese were playing a different game. They weren't trying to figure out who the thing was. They were trying to make sure nobody got off the island alive. That's why they attacked the camp the way they did, and that's why Mifune killed Holland. But the American ship is still coming. If they don't uncover the remaining things before it arrives, the thing could get out. Butler says the rescue crew would separate them, treat the wounded, and start moving men ship to ship before they understood what they were dealing with, hammering on the point that the imitation is so perfect that no one would think anything was wrong, and that by the time anyone believed them, it could already be too late. Butler asks Wolfhard where Garfield's notebook is, and he says he gave it to Cavill. Butler wants to show Shishido, but Cavill protests about showing a message to someone who wants them all dead. Butler orders him to hand it over, and he does. When he looks at it, he sees that one page was torn out. But why? Then Shishido helps them understand what Nakadai was doing, communicating in hand motions. The Japanese weren't just burning bodies randomly, they were counting things by looking for corpses that were missing clothes. The burnt Japanese thing is 1, Holland is 2, and Plummer was 3. He points to a section at the end of the note and points off toward the sub, and then tries to say something that they don't quite understand, but one thing is clear. There is another thing that hasn't been revealed yet. Cavill grabs the notebook away from Shishido and looks at the writing, saying that they don't know if what Shishido said is complete bullshit. Wolfhard says that Shishido was pointing at the sub, but Butler questions why Shishido would know that thing number 4 is on the sub. Something doesn't make sense. Each man looks at the others, and they all grip their weapons. Hemsworth begins to raise his flamethrower. Cavill starts to pull his sidearm, and the others follow immediately, creating a standoff. Cavill defends his men, saying that he'd know if they were different, but Butler says it's impossible to tell if someone is an imitation. Wolfhard argues that Holland thing got on the sub, so Butler or Holt could have been infected too. Hemsworth argues that Butler tried to kill Plummer thing. Butler asks if anyone can prove they are wearing the same clothes they left the sub with. Hemsworth reveals his Notre Dame sweater under his chambray shirt. Then Hemsworth sides with Butler. Butler and Hemsworth convince Cavill and Wolfhard to reluctantly give up their weapons while they try to figure this out. Butler and Hemsworth talk privately, and Hemsworth admits that he had given Garfield his jacket as he was bleeding out and is ashamed that he left Garfield to die alone. He says that Holland let him borrow the Betty lighter, and he went back to Garfield's body because he had left it in the jacket pocket and didn't want anyone to know. But when he got there, Garfield's clothes were missing, and he thought it was some strange thing the Japanese did. Then Butler pulls out the Betty lighter, saying that Holland had it when he returned to the sub, meaning Holland may have stripped Garfield's body. Back on the sub, Powell, Radcliffe, and Mifune are tied up. Chalamet holds a torch weapon as the only verified human on the mutiny side. Hoffman says that they need to find a way to test if someone is human. Back on the island, the men go to Garfield's corpse and find it naked, with Garfield's original jacket nearby with a bullet hole and blood in the back. Garfield had been shot in the back, and whoever stole Garfield's clothes is hiding the bullet hole in the back of Garfield's shirt with Hemsworth's jacket. Holland wasn't wearing a jacket, and Plummer was wearing the other sailor's red patch shirt, so neither of them had the bullet hole. Someone else stole Garfield's clothes. Wolfhard removes his jacket, revealing his shirt has no bullet hole either, and Cavill is wearing an officer's uniform. So the conclusion is, either Poulter or Hoffman is wearing Garfield's shirt. One of them is definitely a thing, and both of them are on the submarine. They also find Garfield's flares, and Butler loads one into the flare gun in case they see the Japanese ship approaching. Back on the sub, Chalamet and Hoffman discover that Holland Thing's blood is no longer on the floor where he was stabbed. They go to the forward torpedo room, and it appears that the blood is pooling where Holland Thing's mutated corpse was. When they bring the torch flame near it, the blood scatters. Now they have a test. The revelation with Garfield's missing clothes proves there is a fifth thing, so 2 things have not been revealed. This raises the odds that Wolfhard or Cavill are infected. Cavill's officer uniform doesn't rule him out because there were other officers killed on the island. Wolfhard starts steering suspicion toward everyone, saying that they don't know if everyone on the sub is a thing or if Shishido is a thing. He argues that the Japanese killed their men, burned bodies, and they were forced to watch their friends die slowly overnight crying for their mothers. Cavill can't take it anymore and throws Shishido to the ground, ordering Hemsworth to burn him regardless of if he is a thing or not. Butler tells him to stand down, and they argue. As they are distracted, Shishido breaks free from his ties and snatches the notebook from Cavill, who jumps on him. Shishido looks to be trying to scribble something with a pencil. Butler manages to pull Cavill off of Shishido, and the notebook falls open on the ground. They look over and freeze. Shishido had started to shade the page after the torn out page, revealing an imprint. Butler picks up the notebook and continues shading, revealing the imprint is a map of their camp, including the blind spot where the Japanese attacked. Someone gave the Japanese that map. Suspicion swings to Cavill, and then back to Wolfhard. Wolfhard argues with Cavill, saying that he never even knew about the blind spot. He pulls out Spiegel's picture of his mother and tells Cavill to explain to her how his shitty leadership got her son a chest full of shrapnel. Cavill snaps and tackles Wolfhard to the ground. Hemsworth sees Wolfhard being strangled and doesn't know what to do, yelling for Cavill to stop. Cavill doesn't, and Hemsworth shoots him. For a moment, it looks like Cavill was the thing, but then Butler sees the Madame Butterfly matchbook peeking out of Cavill's shirt pocket. Cavill never changed clothes. They look to Wolfhard, who starts mutating, but the flamethrower won't light. The pilot light isn't working. Hemsworth tries to make it work, but it just sprays fuel at Wolfhard Thing, so Butler fires the flare into Wolfhard Thing, causing him to ignite. Butler tosses Hemsworth the Betty lighter, and he uses it as the pilot light to finish Wolfhard Thing. And they burn Cavill's body just in case. And then they see the American rescue ship on the horizon. The ship that was supposed to save them is here, and now Butler and Hemsworth have to get back to the sub before it reaches them. Meanwhile, on the submarine, Hoffman runs the blood test with Chalamet holding the torch weapon. Powell, Radcliffe, Poulter, and Mifune are tied up. Small drinking glasses, each containing blood, are arranged on the table in front of them, and we see that Powell has secretly gotten out of his hand ties. Radcliffe demands to be untied, saying that he and Chalamet are the only known humans. Hoffman says that no one is exempt from the test. Poulter argues that he shouldn't be tied up if Hoffman isn't. Radcliffe yells that he doesn't want to be tied up next to Poulter. They all start yelling, and Radcliffe gets up and tries to fight Hoffman, knocking him to the floor before being subdued by Chalamet. They decide to tie Radcliffe's hands behind his back this time. Hoffman tells everyone to calm down, and they are just trying to get on the same page, and it's possible no one is infected. The heat from Chalamet's torch makes everyone sweat. Poulter's eyes anxiously shift back and forth. Chalamet and Hoffman test themselves first by heating a butter knife with a torch and pressing it into the blood, and then Mifune. All are negative. Then Powell tests clean, which throws Hoffman. Then they heat the butter knife and press it into Radcliffe's sample. The blood jumps out of the glass. Chaos erupts and the men start freaking out while Hoffman yells for them to wait, but it's too late. Chalamet panics and burns Radcliffe alive before anyone can stop him. But this doesn't make sense. Radcliffe burns on the floor as a human. Someone manipulated the test, and someone is a thing. Then Powell breaks free and grabs Hoffman from behind, pressing his bandaged, possibly contaminated arm against Hoffman's face. So that was Act 2B. Now the clues are finally turning into evidence, but I think the characters are still confused enough to set the stage for Act 3. In Campbell's short story, there was a testing flaw that resulted in a confirmation that one of two characters were infected, but didn't reveal who. I wanted to do something like that to not only keep the question alive as we go into Act 3, but to subvert the audience's expectation that a test scene means a definitive answer. I realized early on that as soon as they discovered a testing method, it would be too easy for them to determine who is infected. I think the setting helped with them not finding it until the right moment, so I was able to have the characters play the game entirely on deduction based on clues. I'm hoping that the audience will forgive not learning who the thing is with the reveal that someone on the sub is definitely a thing. For the island thread, I'm hoping that Garfield's shirt with the bullet hole is a clean enough concept that I can use as a visual indicator of someone being infected. I'll need to find a way to subvert the expectation it has set up though. The risk is that once clothing becomes the proof system, the audience may get too far ahead of the story, so Act 3 probably needs to complicate that instead of just paying it off directly. I think the biggest issue is convincing the audience that the American rescue ship will result in the thing escaping. I originally had Holland Thing and Mescal's Thing's corpses still in the torpedo room, but I went back and had them dump them in the ocean as kind of a safety measure. But now they have nothing to show the rescue ship to back up their story, though Plumber Thing and the Japanese Thing's corpses are still on the island. I need the audience to fully believe that confusion itself is enough for the thing to slip through. I think the thing's main strategy after failing to prevent the humans from discovering that it exists would be to find a way to somehow get verified as a human when they aren't. So the result is, Act 2B mostly works for me because it turns evidence into more problems for the characters. I've learned that in a thing story, that paranoia should build through the characters thinking that they're solving the problem. In Carpenter's movie, Act 3 shifts fully from MacReady working defense to going on offense against the Thing. Once the blood test is done, MacReady has enough certainty to make a move on the final Thing. After finding Blair's spaceship, he decides to destroy the game entirely to prevent the Thing from winning. Act 3 is going to be tricky to write. I think Act 3 is the biggest flaw of Carpenter's movie, because once the blood test is concluded, the tension of figuring out who is infected basically goes away, and it turns into a monster battle, with an awesome ambiguity button at the end. Instead of going bigger, I think I need to go more focused on that central infection question to keep the tension going. So my Act 3 problem is, how do I keep the paranoia as the climax, instead of resolving the paranoia and then switching to a bigger monster fight? I need to keep the story moving while setting up an ending that is both ambiguous and satisfying. I think the question of who is Thing number 5 is going to keep the audience engaged, but I need to make sure to bring in enough other elements that it doesn't feel like we're just doing that for a half hour. I also have the difficult task of killing off enough characters to leave me with the ending situation that I'm trying to get to without it feeling too forced. Mifune has been too passive of a character and basically missing from the story for a while. I need to bring him back in a way that seems right for his character. I also need to bring the damaged sub situation back in to complete the thread in a way that doesn't make it seem like the situation was set up solely for plot convenience. I think the trickiest part is going to be prolonging the tension of who is Thing number 5 while the characters are taking active steps to solve it. Maybe I can combine some of these needs in a way so they help each other out. If the rescue ship arrives, I need a new, more intense ticking clock to replace it. I also need to pay off the bullet hole shirt in an unexpected way. So instead of forcing a big monster battle, I want the movie to climax with something more psychological that brings the paranoia at the movie's core to its peak. Okay, here is Act 3. Act 3 starts with Butler and Hemsworth rowing back to the submarine, where smoke is still coming out of the top hatch from Radcliffe's burning. Inside, everything has collapsed. Chalamet is in a panic having burned the human Radcliffe. Hoffman claims Powell switched the samples and is the Thing. Powell claims Hoffman is lying. Chalamet is completely falling apart and the torch weapon is spent. Butler and Hemsworth arrive with a gun and flamethrower, but there's no time to figure out what's going on. The American rescue ship is coming. If they stay on the surface, the Thing wins. So Powell gives the order to dive. The damaged submarine barely responds. Radcliffe, the diving officer, is dead, so Butler has to work the dive controls. Hemsworth removes his flamethrower and drops it next to Butler, as he and Poulter run to secure the hatches in time. The sub is off balance. The hull groans. The flamethrower slides across the control room, hitting the wall next to Hoffman, and for a moment, it feels like they're going to lose the sub. Then Powell takes over the controls and levels it out. They're underwater again, which means the rescue ship can't reach them. But now they're trapped in a damaged submarine, and someone is a Thing. Hoffman picks up the flamethrower that slid near him, and after a tense beat, he hands it back to Hemsworth, who straps it on. Butler and Hemsworth turn back to the clue from the island. Either Hoffman or Poulter should be wearing Garfield's bullet hole shirt. Hoffman removes his jacket, and there's no bullet hole. So attention turns to Poulter. Poulter panics, having just seen the human Radcliffe burned alive, and not knowing what supposed clue they're looking for. He lunges for the flamethrower, and Butler shoots him. Hemsworth wants to burn Poulter's body, but Powell warns that if they start burning bodies below the surface, they'll suffocate. Butler needs to remove Poulter's jacket to check for the bullet hole shirt to make sure it's him. Powell argues that it's too dangerous to check him after Hall and Thing played dead. Butler suggests burning some of his blood, but before they can, all hell breaks loose. Screws blow, saltwater sprays in, they look over and the depth gauge has fallen into the red. The hull starts to creak like it's about to implode. They run back to their stations. Powell manages to save the boat by blowing the ballast, but the situation is getting worse by the second, and finally, they stop the sub from sinking further. Saltwater has sprayed onto Poulter's blood, so they can't reliably test for a reaction to fire. Butler goes looking for something to cut Poulter's jacket off, to make him less vulnerable while he checks Poulter's shirt. In the control room, Hemsworth orders Chalamet to tie up Hoffman and Powell, and then go get Mifune. He does, but when he goes to get Mifune, he sees that Mifune is missing. Butler looks through cabinets for scissors or a knife, and then finds a chambray shirt stuffed in a drawer. It has the bullet hole in the back. It's Garfield's shirt. Then he turns and sees Mifune standing there, free, holding his unsheathed katana. Mifune stabs Butler. Hemsworth hears something and goes to investigate. He finds Butler bleeding out. Butler whispers that it could still be Hoffman. Then Mifune attacks Hemsworth too. Hemsworth turns and grabs the blade as it enters his body. and reaches out and crushes Mifune's throat before they both fall dead. Now only 3 are left: Powell, Hoffman, and Chalamet. Chalamet finds the bodies and comes back to the control room wearing the flamethrower and with Butler's pistol tucked in his waistband. He says everyone else is dead. Powell says that it would take at least 2 people to even have a chance of surfacing the submarine. Then Powell and Hoffman both make their case. Hoffman says Powell switched his blood sample with Radcliffe's, which means Powell is the thing. Powell says he did switch the samples because Hoffman switched his first. Both of them sound possible, and both of them need Chalamet to choose right now. The submarine is creaking and moaning around them. Chalamet points the flamethrower back and forth between them, completely unable to carry the weight of the decision. He looks over and sees Poulter's body nearby. Then, he pulls his sidearm, puts it under his chin, and pulls the trigger. His body slumps back. Now there's only the sound of the creaking hull. Powell and Hoffman look at Chalamet's body, then back at each other. Hoffman asks, "So now what do we do?" We cut to Poulter's body laying face down in a few inches of salt water and linger a little too long. Then we cut to Butler, Hemsworth, and Mifune's bodies. The Betty lighter has fallen out of Hemsworth's pocket and is lying on the floor. Then we cut back to the island. Shishido hides in the foliage, watching as the American rescue ship reaches the submarine's location. We hold on his face as he watches, holding as he watches to see if the sub will surface. Holding. And then, a dirty hand comes in from behind and covers Shishido's mouth. We're still holding on Shishido's face, and then we hear a voice whisper in Japanese, "We're saved." Shishido's eyes dart around before a sudden wave of realization. We cut to Spiegel's now open grave. And then fade to black. The end. Act 3 was also pretty difficult because on the one hand, it's satisfying to me, but I have no idea how the audience will take not only not learning who the thing is, but not having a thing reveal and mutation at all in Act 3. I think that's the biggest risk of the ending. While I paid off nearly everything in the story, I'm leaving the audience with that tension. It makes sense to me to have the Thing franchise have a ritual of one major focused unanswered question to debate. I did write it with an answer in mind, but there are 4 possibilities. We know that either Poulter or Hoffman are infected, and we don't know if Powell is infected. It's probably pretty obvious the way it's plotted, so it would take some stronger concealment if it was actually made into a script. I think regardless of if the audience is able to figure out who is Thing number 5, there is still at least one Thing alive on the sub, while Carpenter's could have easily been no Things left. So realistically, we don't know if the Thing is won, but I guess it would all come down to whether Powell is infected or not, because you need to have at least 2 people to surface the sub. I think the Thing's best bet is if it was Poulter, because he could just get up and assimilate the others. If it's Hoffman, he can't assimilate Poulter because Poulter is dead. I'm hoping the implication is that either Shishido is going to see the sub surface or not. I think I did alright with paying off the submarine situation, but I'm unsure if people are going to think that Mifune killing Butler and Hemsworth is a cop-out. My thought is that Mifune wants to kill everyone, including himself, to stop the Thing threat, and thinks that stabbing people might both prevent them from being able to surface the sub, and could potentially cause a Thing to reveal itself. The thing I need to make sure in a full scripted version is that Mifune's choice feels like kind of a self-sacrifice strategy and not a plot convenience. He can't just suddenly become useful because I need 2 characters dead. His logic has to be clear, and I think the lesson of Act 3 is that ambiguity can work if the question is focused. The audience expects answers, but I think with something like Inception, Memories of Murder, or The Thing, if you understand by the end that the ambiguity is the point because it is better than an answer, then I think the audience can get on board with a movie leaving an itch unscratched. Well, this experiment was insanely difficult and took months, and $200 to fix a stupid hard drive failure that nearly killed the whole video. Thanks so much to my patrons, by the way. Doing this has taught me that breaking a story is pretty much like trying to create and solve a puzzle at the same time. But this experiment was gratifying in a lot of ways. I don't hate what I came up with as much as I would have thought, and I really want to try to write some other stuff. It's interesting how this started as an experiment on what would make a good Thing movie, and kind of turned into me facing my fears and actually put all the stuff I've been teaching myself since I was 5 into practice. The problems I was facing were common ones. They're right when they say that Act 2 makes you want to pull your hair out. I would say Act 2A was the most difficult act by far. I spent so much time trying to have Plumber Thing reveal himself by having knowledge that he shouldn't have, but it was just too difficult the way the situation was set up. I was going to have it that Garfield's body was moved, but Plumber Thing was able to lead Holt there anyway. It wasn't working and I was going crazy until I went back and added in the red patch. Garfield's Red Notebook was also a late addition. I was pretty excited when I thought of that because it helped me solve a lot of problems at once, like communicating what Nakadai was doing and telling the audience how many things there are, while being a decently smart strategy for Wolfhard Thing knowing Japanese that ultimately backfired because of Shishido. I do think it would be cool for the inherited memories idea to come into play, with a character accidentally revealing themselves to be a thing by knowing too much, and maybe being forced to act on a piece of info they shouldn't know. Act 1 was the easiest act to write, but it did change a fair amount. Before I discovered the Powell contamination angle, my original idea was to have the panicky Chalamet be convinced he was infected, and so they quarantine him, and then the entire movie plays out and everyone dies and he ends up just walking away as a human, having avoided the whole situation. I think by far my biggest failure with this story was that I wasn't able to pull off the one aspect I said gives Thing movies such a unique potential, and that is having a Thing threat established and then having someone who started as an ally become infected at some point. Maybe failure is too harsh, but it's definitely the biggest thing I wasn't able to make work because the clothing concept was stretched enough as it is. I don't know that Carpenters really did this either, but I was imagining some kind of scenario where a Thing would have to work toward the Thing's goals after already making some progress against the Thing's goals. I think the best candidate if I did a rewrite would either be Cavill or Hemsworth, or maybe Mifune. They'd probably use Spiegel's clothes, but would need some kind of explanation as to why the clothes are dirty in a way that directs suspicion to something else. I literally came up with this Spiegel ending just now as I'm finishing the edit. Before I just had us fade to black as Shishido is watching the rescue ship. And you tell me what's better. So I don't think this treatment proves I wrote the perfect Thing movie. It proves that the engine works, and it proves that the engine is hard, especially when you have to deal with the torn clothing rule. This is by far the most time I've spent on a single video, and I actually wrote a bunch of stuff getting into all the things I found in my research while preparing to write a Thing movie that I'll put on Patreon. It has all my research on the different rules from various Thing media, including the Thing rules that were cut from Lancaster's original script, what Carpenter's movie changed about the creature from Campbell's original short story, where I think the 2011 prequel went wrong, a look at other movies that are similar to The Thing, and more. But for now, I think the answer is yes. The Thing can be made into an anthology. We can leave MacReady and Childs frozen in the snow and move on to new scenarios with all the twists and turns that made us love Carpenter's original without rehashing or conflicting with it. So now I must pass the question off to you. What did you think of this exercise? Were there any glaring issues that I didn't consider? Did I write a Thing movie that doesn't suck?